Hello, Minnesota. Welcome to the Tony Hernandez Show. I'm your host, Tony Hernandez. Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful summer day in Minnesota. I hope you're out there enjoying it with family, barbecuing. Thank everyone for tuning in. We broadcast live every Saturday from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in SCC Television Studios in White Bear Lake, and they also play our live broadcast on SPNN in St. Paul, so we thank those stations, and thank you for tuning in. We got a pretty great show today. I'm not going to bring on any guests, but I'm going to be talking about some serious issues, and we're going to be talking about also the historical context of the American presidency, leadership in times of triumph and in times of conflict. And as many of you seen on the news last week, there's a big event. A Malaysian commercial airliner was gunned down over Ukrainian skies. There's allegations that Russia or Russian pro-insurgents within the Ukraine shot this plane down. And I'm bringing this up because I believe that this is a major historical event that is somewhat being bypassed through the media in terms of the consequences with our relationship as Americans to the rest of the world and what's going to happen here. It's not an unprecedented event. Commercial airliners and commercial boats with passengers have been shot down before. The Lusitania is a great example of that, and there was actually a Korean airline jet that was shot down earlier in the 1980s when President Reagan was president. So this isn't an unprecedented event. Acts of violence and war against civilians and against commercial travel has taken place, and the reason why I think it's significant now is the way that the leadership of our federal government has been dealing with it. It seems like it's somewhat being swept under the rug. And so really what this show is going to be about is we're going to start by playing a clip of President Obama. I think it was on the day of the attacks against the Malaysian jet. He was in Delaware for a campaign event, and he designated 30 seconds to a minute starting his speech talking about the attack on the Malaysian jet, and then he goes on into his campaign speech. And what I'm going to be comparing that to after that is President Reagan, and this is a flashback in time, but this was one of the more memorable and tense moments of the Cold War. This was in September 5th, and basically when the Soviet Union attacked and hit a civilian airliner, and it was leaving from Alaska going to Korea. It was a Korean airliner, and it was shot down. And so we're going to compare the two different presidents' responses to this. And then we're going to go through a historical context. I have a number of different videos that I dug up through research that just shows we're going to have a President Lincoln moment, the Gettysburg Address. We're going to be hearing from President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then we're going to hear from Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower or Ike, President Kennedy, and then we're going to move to President Reagan and then move to President Bush. And we're going to be analyzing and talking about this progression in history and the way that American leaders, presidents have dealt with conflict, have dealt with triumph, and the way that they addressed the American people. And my basic premise is that what we're lacking in modern America in the year 2014 is this type of leadership that has been demonstrated in the past by American presidents in terms of reaching out to the American people, looking into the camera, touching their hearts, or giving eloquent, meaningful speeches that really address the conflict or the crisis or the triumph at hand. And I believe that in the past, it has been much more healthy for Americans and for our country and for people to deal with tragedy and triumph in the historical context of events, and helping people to gain an understanding, to heal, and to also become stronger and move forward from that event. So we're going to start with the presidential address I was talking about. This is President Obama, and this is a speech that he made when the Malaysian plane was shot down, and he is in Delaware for, like I said, it was a campaign event. And this is the words that he chose to address what I believe is a very big issue of the Malaysian jet getting shot down over Ukrainian skies. So Dallas, if we can line this up, and we'll play it now.
Everybody, please have a seat. Please have a seat. It is wonderful to be back in Delaware. Before I begin, obviously the world is watching reports of a downed passenger jet near the Russia-Ukraine border. And it looks like it may be a terrible tragedy. Right now we're working to determine whether there were American citizens on board. That is our first priority. And I've directed my national security team to stay in close contact with the Ukrainian government. The United States will offer any assistance we can to help determine what happened and why. And as a country, our thoughts and prayers are with all the families of the passengers wherever they call home. I want to thank Jeremy for that introduction. Give Jeremy a big round of applause. It is great to be in the state that gave us Joe Biden.
So you can see there, that's the first clip. That was the day that the news broke of the Malaysian jet bombing that took place over the Ukraine-Russia border. We still don't know the full extent of this story, but I find it remarkable because, granted, President Obama was not planning to give a speech about this, but he was at a campaign event in Delaware, but he only dedicated about a minute to this specific story. Doesn't really go into great details. And beyond giving his condolences to the victims, which we all definitely should give them their respect and the honor for those who perished and died in this attack, it moved quickly to his campaign speech. And so we're going to contrast that now with the event that took place on September 1st, 1983. Russia shot down Korean Airlines flight 007, a flight from New York City to Seoul with a stop in Anchorage, Alaska. And after departing Alaska, the plane crossed into Russian airspace and was shot down. All 269 passengers on board were killed. And I will concede there are a few differences between this situation and the Malaysian jet crash. However, there are many, many similarities. The number of people who died. It was an attack on a commercial airline with civilian passengers, and it wasn't a military-on-military conflict. And we're going to compare now and hear from President Reagan, who gave these memorable comments. He talked for almost 15 minutes. We're not going to play the entire address. We'll just play a few minutes, but it'll give really a good contrast versus leadership that we had from the presidency in the 80s. And the way that they addressed a conflict and potential military escalation. And also, if you notice how President Reagan makes a case to the American people about what happened, presents the facts, and he also swiftly condemns the acts as acts of cowardice, which anyone would agree that attacking a civilian airline with unarmed passengers, civilians, is truly an act of cowardice, and it should be explained as such. And so now we'll hear from President Reagan giving this address in 1983.
Those were the voices of the Soviet pilots. In this tape, the pilot who fired the missile describes his search for what he calls the target. He reports he has it in sight. Indeed, he pulls up to within about a mile of the Korean plane, mentions its flashing strobe light and that its navigation lights are on. He then reports he's reducing speed to get behind the airliner, gives his distance from the plane at various points in this maneuver, and finally announces what can only be called the Korean airline massacre. He says he has locked on the radar, which aims his missiles, has launched those missiles, the target has been destroyed, and he is breaking off the attack. Let me point out something here having to do with his close-up view of the airliner on what we know was a clear night with a half moon. The 747 has a unique and distinctive silhouette, unlike any other plane in the world. There is no way a pilot could mistake this for anything other than a civilian airliner. And if that isn't enough, let me point out our RC-135 that I mentioned earlier had been back at its base in Alaska on the ground for an hour when the murderous attack took place over the Sea of Japan. And make no mistake about it, this attack was not just against ourselves or the Republic of Korea. This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations. They deny the deed, but in their conflicting and misleading protestations, the Soviets reveal that, yes, shooting down a plane, even one with hundreds of innocent men, women, children, and babies, is a part of their normal procedure if that plane is in what they claim as their airspace. They owe the world an apology and an offer to join the rest of the world in working out a system to protect against this ever happening again. Among the rest of us, there is one protective measure, an international radio wavelength on which pilots can communicate with planes of other nations if they are in trouble or lost. Soviet military planes are not so equipped because that would make it easier for pilots who might want to defect. Our request to send vessels into Soviet waters.
So that gives you a pretty good idea. And like I said, this clip goes on for 15 minutes, and it's President Reagan, prime time, addressing the nation on the terrible, he called it a murderous attack on a civilian airline. And it's exactly what it is. And he took the time to also explain the morality of it all, the good versus evil, the act, and condemning the act, and separating ourselves as Americans who believe in the right to life and to freedom, and drawing that distinction versus what we're up against. You know, people who don't have the humanity, people who can look and see that they're going to murder nearly 300 civilians, and explaining the American value and viewpoint on that. And it's something I think that gives a very harsh contrast between the American political leadership of today versus yesterday. And we're going to continue to turn back the clock here with this episode of the Tony Hernandez Show, and we're going to be talking more about past presidents and how they have dealt with conflict and triumph and overcoming it, and also communicating to the American people where we feel like we are connecting with the leaders despite the political party, despite the political ideology. It is at times of crisis, and it's at times of conflict when truly Americans come together and we get behind our leaders, and we feel as strong as ever in our identity as freedom-loving Americans. And so what better place to start than the Civil War? And this is an interesting speech that we're going to hear by President Abraham Lincoln. And this is the famous Gettysburg Address, which was only about a minute or 2-minute speech. And he said so much in those 2 minutes, and his words and the message went on to live in infamy and in historical context that really put together the American feelings at this time of the Civil War. And we'll line up this clip right now. Again, this is Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, and we're going to hear a little bit of a pretext going into the speech.
Lincoln was impressed that the twin victories had come on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, because he said the rebels were trying to overthrow the principle that all men were created equal. This, he said, is a glorious theme for a speech. And that speech would come a few months later at Gettysburg itself. A war cemetery was being dedicated there, and Lincoln was invited to make a few appropriate remarks. At the ceremony in November, the president listened for 2 hours as the designated orator, Edward Everett, recalled the Gettysburg battle. People were expecting another long speech when Lincoln rose, but he sat down again just 2 minutes later, before photographers could capture him speaking. He'd needed only 10 sentences to distill the essence of the Union cause and why the North must keep fighting.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave here the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
As he sat down, Lincoln is alleged to have said, "That speech won't scour," an uncomplimentary farming term. But the other speaker, Edward Everett, told him, "I wish I had come as close to the central meaning of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." And the Chicago Tribune accurately predicted that the speech will live among the annals of man.
It's pretty amazing that he used that quote, that speech won't scour, after he finished it. And rumor has it, or the historical rumor has it, that he scribbled that speech on a napkin prior to when he gave it. And, you know, just to put it in historical context, you put all these people at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. You have all these mixed feelings, you know, maybe some Southern sympathizers, and also the Union soldiers and family members of people who died in that particular battle. And you have all these people gathered around for this dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery, and then they had a 2-hour orator, which just puts the historical thing that people's attention spans today wouldn't sit and listen to somebody recalling the events with a 2-hour oratory about what happened at the Gettysburg battle, or the Battle of Gettysburg. But that's how they did things back then. I also thought it was remarkable that, so he gave a speech, President Lincoln gave a speech for 2 minutes, and they weren't able to snap a single picture or photo from those 2 minutes that he was up there, which contrasts pretty hard today, because 2 minutes you can snap off who knows how many pictures. You know, people got their iPhones and everything like that. There'd be millions and millions of pictures taken in those first 2 moments, but a different time in the Civil War era. And we're going to fast forward, as I stated, that this show isn't about great Republican presidents, although there are many great Republican presidents in American history. There's a lot of great Democratic presidents as well. And really, what we're trying to touch on is not the political ideology or what party the particular president was from, but their ability to reach out and unify the American people, to recognize a significant historical event or conflict or tragedy and bring everybody together, and also to communicate the essence of how people feel at that time. And President Lincoln said that his speech wouldn't go down, it wouldn't be known for nothing, and that it would be the people's actions on the Gettysburg battlefield that history would remember. And he was right about that, but he was wrong about how his speech would live on and continue to be memorized and talked about by Americans to this day. So fast forwarding now to Pearl Harbor Address to the Nation by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Franklin D. Roosevelt's Pearl Harbor Address to the Nation was on December 8th, 1941, the same day as the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's a day that would live on in infamy in American history, unprecedented attack on American soil from the Japanese, and it shook the country to its core. And this is how FDR used his voice as president to address the country, and we will watch that now.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
So that's President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he is addressing, and I got to make a correction, Pearl Harbor took place the day before this address. So that was on December 7th, and this address took place on December 8th, 1941. That's FDR addressing, I believe it's Congress and the American people, talking, making that distinction. He called the hostilities that they exist. He's not sugarcoating anything, and I hope people don't interpret that, I believe that we need to become more militaristic. I'm not saying that by no means, but I do believe we need our American political leaders defining good versus evil and standing up against evil, standing up against the aggressive hostility of other state and actors, and positioning the American position and declaring the will of the people as 100% against these types of acts. And FDR had a way to really talk to the American people. He did it through the fireside chats. He did it through camera. People revered and adored the man, and it went beyond any political ideology. He is called the great progressive, or the first progressive president of the United States, and I don't know if that's necessarily true when you compare the definitions of being a progressive in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s versus what it means to be progressive now. I think progressive, modern progressives is something different versus the kind of progressive that FDR was. It's just some important point to keep in mind there. And later on, President Dwight D. Eisenhower became President of the United States, and I'm playing this clip because this is one that has gained immense popularity after he made these points to the American public. It was on his way out of the presidency after serving his term, and this speech, or the segment of the speech, has received a lot of notoriety because this is a great example of an outgoing president using the experience and the knowledge and some of the backroom information that he learned about the whole system that we have in place, and warning the American people about the potential danger of the buildup of the military-industrial complex. He is the one who coined that phrase, or made that phrase promoted that phrase to make it bigger, but the military-industrial complex. This is President Eisenhower addressing the American people and warning about this upcoming danger or threat to the nation as he saw it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So that's President Eisenhower addressing on the military-industrial complex, and I chose that clip because it's been used as a reference point even now more and more, and he says some very important statements in this address to the American people, and he did it in a way that it was able to live on and also to help to make people more aware. But one thing he said is we must not fail to comprehend the very grave consequences of the military-industrial complex. He also said that the citizenry needs to be aware and alert and to act accordingly, and also to recognize the severe weight that this enormous bureaucracy and sub-economy of military armaments and arms dealers and arms production, the effect that this has on our culture, he said spirituality, and others. And I believe this is a very important point and concept that he's trying to make us aware of. And it's important because if you look at the recent history of the United States, as he pointed out, he had just come off of 4 wars, the Korean War. They were getting ready to go into Vietnam, and then escalates in later decades into the Middle East, into Iraq, into Afghanistan. And we have been at a constant state of war for essentially my entire young adult life. And not saying there's not a reason that we have been going to war. I'm not saying that we should dishonor our veterans or anything of that sort. I believe that veterans deserve the utmost respect and honor that any American deserves. But I do think we also need to be aware of how the political forces that be have the potential to hijack this enormous military industry and to create their own supply and demands. If you're selling arms, what do you want? You want more people buying arms. What's a great way to get more people to buy arms? It's to have wars. And oftentimes these arms dealers and defense contractors and people that operate in this quasi-private public world of arms dealing, they arm both sides of a conflict. And they do so because they have one market over here and one market over here, and it increases the marketability of their product and ultimately increases their sales, enriches people, empowers people, and they have that partnership with the governments as well. And all of this is very, very dangerous. All these influences are very, very dangerous when you put them into the context of the world powers and world conflicts and who benefits and who doesn't benefit. And more often than not, it is the poor and people in the lower classes that do not benefit from war, and it's the people in the higher and most elite classes of society, of the world society, that benefit. And another example is if you look at the resurgence of what's happening in Iraq with the ISIS and coming from Syria and coming into Iraq, and when the U.S. trained Iraqi soldiers were fleeing from the bases, running from the ISIS, what did they leave behind but the multi-billions of dollars that we American citizens, taxpayers, paid for to arm these Iraqi armies that essentially deserted their post the second the enemy showed up, and deserted the Humvees, deserted the rocket launchers, deserted the guns, and the ISIS was able to take all of this American artillery and are now using it against American soldiers and against American interests and against civilians. And this is a tragedy. This is should be an outrage for the American taxpayer. And it's also something that we need to remember and keep in context with what President Eisenhower was saying in his address about the military-industrial complex and the forces and the counter forces that are present within this in terms of working against actually American ideals of freedom, free enterprise, liberty, and all of those, it actually can be used against us. And so all of us out there need to be more aware, need to be more conscious, we need to do more research, and we need to have more independent thought and discussion in our society and in our public debates so that we can better get to the bottom of the truth, because it is very hard to determine, decipher what is truth and what is lies these days. And the more knowledge and the more that people can be empowered and the more debate that takes place, I believe the closer we can get to the truth. And this next clip that I'm going to play is chosen. It's not an American president, but this is a debate between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and there's a couple of video clips added to the end of it. But they had a television debate between their conflicting visions on how to cure the inequalities of race in America and the world. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, promoted nonviolent means to change, whereas Malcolm X took a more defensive, militaristic viewpoint towards trying to change or resolve the inequality that they saw amongst races and classes in America. And I'm playing this clip because I believe it is a very healthy debate, as much as it is uncomfortable for perhaps some to watch. But it shows, how there was really a strong encouragement between the two, and also to publicly broadcast this debate and show people the differences in the philosophy. And when you watch it and when you listen to these two educated people, two knowledgeable people talk about their different philosophies, I believe that we can all get a higher version of the truth by listening to their experiences conflict and to debate with one another. And it allows people to come to a higher sense of reasoning and a higher sense of empowerment and independence in terms of deciding what's right and wrong, what's good and evil, and what's truth and what's lie. So we'll play this now, and I'll be back.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they've taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack of the Klan in that
Well,
day.
I don't think of love as, in this context, as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force, but I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. This is what I try to teach in the struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing. That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadened complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with nonviolence.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to give Negroes a chance to sit in a segregated restaurant beside the same white man who had brutalized them for 400 years. The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forgetting what those whites have done to them. But the masses of black people in America today don't go for what Martin Luther King is putting down. As you said in one of your articles, it's psychologically insecure, something of that sort. I forget how you put it. But you didn't endorse what Martin Luther King was doing yourself.
I do not reject his goals of full integration and full equality rights for American citizens. Do you reject these goals?
If you don't think that he's walking on the right road, I'm quite sure you don't agree that he'll get to the right place. And if you would classify his method as psychologically unrealistic, I think that if a man's method is psychologically unrealistic, which means the road or the means or the method that he's using, I think as a psychologist, you'd be very doubtful
I don't think
that he would reach the right.
If anyone has ever lived with a nonviolent movement in the South, from Montgomery on through the Freedom Rides and through the sit-in movement and the recent Birmingham movement, and see the reactions of many of the extremists and reactionaries in the white community, he wouldn't say that this movement makes, or this philosophy makes him comfortable. I think it arouses a sense of shame within him often, in many instances. I think it does something to touch the conscience and establish a sense of guilt. Now, so often people respond to guilt by engaging more in the guilt-evoking act in an attempt to drown the sense of guilt. But this approach certainly doesn't make the white man feel comfortable. It disturbs this conscience, and it disturbs this sense of contentment.
Nothing will they ever do. They will always talk it, but they won't practice it. And with the Supreme Court, if the NAACP can tell me that they want a desegregation decision for me 10 years ago, but yet the schools haven't been desegregated, as I say, this is a victory with no victory. It's a victory that you can talk about, but it's a victory you can't show me. So if you represent the NAACP and you are telling me about this great victory you won for me, when I look at you, I have to conclude that either you have been duped yourself or else you are trying to dupe me. And in most instances where the civil rights struggle is involved, there is no civil rights leader can point to me one concrete gain, practical gain that black people have made in the civil rights field in this country, not only during the past 10 years, but during the past 100 years.
I don't think there's any real organization to the riots. I think they grow out of the conditions that I've mentioned all along. And as long as these intolerable conditions are there, as long as the Negro finds himself living every day in a major depression, then every city will sit on a powder keg and can explode over the slightest incident. I feel that killing is a very tragic way to deal with any social problem. There is no violent solution to the problem that the Negro confronts in this country, and this is why I have constantly said that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. After all, the Negro ends up on the losing end. We can't win a violent revolution. Most of the persons killed in riots are Negroes themselves. The persons who end up not being able to get milk for their children are Negroes because things where they have to live are destroyed. So there's no practical or moral answer in the realm of violence to the Negro's problem.
So that's a little back and forth public debate between Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. And I'm again showing this because I believe it shows from a historical context the rigorous public debates that took place pretty recently in our history, which I believe are lacking today. We don't have the great discussions of controversial topics anymore because everything has to be so politically correct. The media is afraid to touch or to talk about issues of race in any sort of substantial manner where there's any sort of substantial debate. They'll all pile up on one side, but they won't hear the opposing viewpoint. And in this case, to hear Dr. Martin Luther King's testimony on nonviolence and the difference between non-resistance and non-violence, and how that you can resist through non-violent means, and that if you're engaged in non-resistance without any type of a mechanism, that you will be trampled on. And you can see the differences between that and the theory of Malcolm X, who said that we need to fight back. What sort of gains have the civil rights movement made in terms of improving people's lives? And you can even see that today, because the racial inequalities in America still exist, and we've had all this progress when it comes to civil rights legislation and legislation aimed at equality. However, we still see an enormous amount of inequality, and one could even make the argument that there could potentially be more racial disparity and inequality today than there was prior to the civil rights. And there should be a great debate about why this is or why this isn't, and what we can be doing from a civic point of view and from a cultural point of view to increase the opportunities for all Americans and increase the opportunities for people who are born into poverty, to increase their opportunities to escape from that poverty, to excel in education, and to graduate and to go on to create jobs or to get high-paying jobs or to become involved in research and to really make a difference in our free society and get people thinking big again. Get people thinking about the American dream and what we can do if we fully accept our role in the world and accept our leadership and accept our freedom, and to use that freedom to promote what we need to. And with that, it's a good lead into our next speech here, and it's going to be some great moments from President John F. Kennedy's tenure as president, short tenure that is, and to really hear from him about some of the ideas that he wanted to ignite in the American spirit, in the American people, and to really get people to believe again that we can do these impossible things if we stay true to our dream and true to our calling. And with that, we'll line up some great moments where President John F. Kennedy is speaking directly to the heart and soul of the people.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I pledge you that we shall neither commit nor provoke aggression, that we shall neither flee nor invoke the threat of force, that we shall never negotiate out of fear, and we shall never fear to negotiate. Terror is not a new weapon. Throughout history, it has been used by those who could not prevail either by persuasion or example. But inevitably they fail, either because men are not afraid to die for a life worth living, or because the terrorists themselves came to realize that free men cannot be frightened by threats and that aggression would meet its own response. And it is in the light of that history that every nation today should know, be he friend or foe, that the United States has both the will and the weapons to join free men in standing up to their responsibilities. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
There he says, we choose to go to the moon. He said, we choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And I can't think of better words that really exemplify the American spirit and the true history of our people and our culture is we don't do things because they're easy. We do them because we're hard. Another thing that President Kennedy said is, he went on to say that free men cannot be frightened by threats. And that statement to me, I'll say it again, free men cannot be frightened by threats. And when America is strong, when individuals are strong, when individuals are secure and families are together, people do not get frightened by threats from tiny, puny little terrorists from halfway across the globe or from something that some politician says. It's only when we feel insecure, it's only when we feel like we're not free that these threats start to take a stranglehold, not only over ourselves, but our economy, our way of life, our outlook on life, and our optimism towards what we can achieve and how successful we can become. It's only when we are feeling unfree and under threat that these become strangled and smothered and threatened from ever coming to fruition. And President Kennedy, in many, many different ways, touched the heart of the American people like very few people have. And moving forward to President Reagan once again, we're going to watch briefly his address after the Challenger. If you remember the Challenger, when that exploded with the teacher on there, they were making a mission to outer space. And I'll never forget, I was in second grade in Mrs. Eschenbacher's class in Nativity when we heard the news of the Challenger and the disastrous outcome of that. And it's a great example of a time in American history where we needed our leader to reach out and to let us know that not only the tragedy occurred, but that it was okay to feel grief and that we could heal from that grief and move forward. And we'll watch that right now.
To you tonight to report on the State of the Union. The events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
So there, President Reagan is addressing the American people after a national tragedy, losing the astronauts. And the prior video, I showed President Kennedy igniting the optimism of America, the I can do spirit, that anything is possible, that we can go to the moon, and moving to President Reagan, mourning with the nation after we lost some brave astronauts who were fulfilling the dream and the calling of President Kennedy. And it was just one of those moments where you're just glad to have a leader like President Reagan to reach out and tell the people how they're feeling almost, or to explain to the world or explain to our national consciousness how we are all feeling and how we are all grieving. He spoke directly to the families of the people who lost their parents or uncles or aunts or brothers, sisters on that particular spacecraft heading for outer space, and it's just truly a touching moment. And again, I believe this type of leadership style is something that we are severely lacking today and across the board in our political spectrum. I'm not just saying one seat or one person, but across the board we are losing that American connection to our politics, and I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to, and we need to understand why this is. And this brings us to our last clip that I'm going to be playing here, and this is President Bush shortly after September 11th attacks. I think it's just days after, when President Bush went to visit the ground zero, to where the actual attacks on the Twin Towers took place. And I've definitely been a critic of President Bush at certain times. I don't think we should have went into Iraq and invaded Iraq. I believe that was a huge mistake. But this is really pre-Iraq, and this is September 11th. And I believe that President Bush does an incredible job reaching out to the American people, being there right where the attacks took place. You really can't touch the hearts, or nobody could argue with them at this point. And a lot of liberals trash President Bush after September 11th and into the remaining of his 2 terms as president. But at this point in time, President Bush had the entire nation behind him.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
So in conclusion, we're coming to the end of the show. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and really this show was about the American leadership and how we desperately need, once again, political leaders who are out there communicating the will of the people, communicating the feelings of this country, and once again reigniting the American dream. May God bless you, may God bless America, and vaya con Dios.